This is the Dollar Diplomacy video. There's 3 goals to this video. Number 1, know why Taft instituted dollar diplomacy. 2, know how it was designed to work. 3, know how well it worked in Nicaragua. Taft's vision. So Howard Taft became president after Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was the president from 1901 to 1908, and Taft won the election of 1908 because people convinced Theodore Roosevelt that he should not run. Taft, also a Republican, had similar goals to Theodore Roosevelt, but was a very different president, very different man, much more of a businessman, much more of a lawyer, and wanted to find other ways of doing this than in the aggressive policies of Theodore Roosevelt. So number 1, Taft's vision was dollars for bullets. The idea is that with Roosevelt, you used bullets, or you used the army as a way of getting people to do what you wanted. In this case, what Taft wants to do is the promise of investment to give people money to get them to do what they want them to do. So, dollars for bullets furthered policy aims in Latin America and East Asia through economic power. Taft described his own policy in his last speech. The diplomacy of the present administration has sought to respond to modern ideas of commercial intercourse. This policy has been characterized as substituting dollars for bullets. It is one that appeals alike to idealistic humanitarian sentiments, to the dictates of sound policy and strategy, and to legitimate commercial aims. Efforts to trade with the British and Spanish colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Defense of the rights of neutrals to trade in wartime and support of the most favored nation concept were all predecessors of dollar diplomacy. Yet dollar diplomacy was the subject of much controversy during Taft's administration and years that follow. And you might wonder why, because dollar diplomacy itself, paying people to do what you want, is something that goes way back. But let's see exactly how they wanted to use this, and maybe we'll see the controversy. In 1910, for the first time, the United States was exporting more manufactured goods than they were agricultural goods. Taft recognized by 1909 the United States was producing more goods than America could consume and therefore had to increase export. In 1910, to be exact, that's the United States export more manufactured goods than raw materials. Needed to create markets in other countries. This arrangement would aid U.S. by alleviating overproduction, supplying needed manufactured goods to underdeveloped countries, and offer monopolized spheres for American investors. Americans can compete with Europeans. As 1909 memorandum indicated, the United States would insist that Americans compete with Europeans in developing countries by buying bonds, floating loans, and building railroads and establishing banks. The idea would be that the United States would work to extend U.S. investment into underdeveloped regions, motivating observers to label his policy, and that's where the dollar diplomacy, but they would go to basically underdeveloped regions and create a situation where it would bring that this economic progress would bring political stability. The idea was, especially within the Caribbean, that this would solve the problem of overproduction, but also would bring stability to the region and would create stable countries in which the United States then would not have to send troops, would not have to constantly work on that. The idea was that foreign governments would gain access to U.S. private bank loans. And that sounds like a great idea. Let's get these banks, U.S. banks, to loan these countries. That would give us sway within these countries, and it would keep the Europeans out, which was a problem under Roosevelt. Now, you have a problem. If somebody were to give you $100 and say, who do you want to lend it to? You probably have somebody that pops in your mind. Hey, this is a person who would pay me back. Now, let's say you would even make a little bit of money. You would get $10 back on the 100. So you get $110 back if you lend that money out. Now, think of somebody who you know you wouldn't want to lend that $100 to. Well, that was the Latin American countries. That was them. And so you have to convince then these banks to then go do that. Well, Theodore Roosevelt solved that problem with the idea of custom receivership. Well, you can guarantee that they would get paid back if you say, if they don't pay us back, we will take over the custom houses, or we will just go ahead and put custom receivership right within the contract. We also are going to send down U.S. financial experts to reorganize their government spending. And that sounds great, like we're helping them out. But a lot of times what the United States advisors would do was reorganize it so that they would get paid back faster and not necessarily help those governments create the wealth that would then help them out of the debt cycle. So here's how it looks. Okay, so you have the banker. The banker is convinced by Taft to loan a large sum to a Caribbean government. That Caribbean government would then spend it back. They would reorganize, spend that money, and then pay the U.S. back through custom receivership. The idea, though, is that the debt never really goes away because the Caribbean governments oftentimes do not spend the money on the types of structure or infrastructure that they need. They also are not encouraged to diversify their crops, to diversify their economy, and to create basically wealth through diversifying and creating a stronger economy. Oftentimes, this debt cycle only really enriches the U.S. Bankers. But the government's reorganized. Now, the other part is you got the bankers want to give the loan. Why would these Caribbean nations want loans from U.S. bankers if you're going to take over their custom houses and basically limit what they can spend? That's where the Payne-Aldrich tariff comes in. Congress gave Taft the ability to take and to basically offer them trade concessions. Hey, we will help you reorganize. We'll give you this loan, and we're also going to open up the U.S. market to more of your sugar or more of your bananas or more of whatever product that country had. And then he could just lower the tariffs as part of this negotiation. It gave him a tool to basically now get the governments to agree. So now he's got the bankers to agree because of custom receivership. He's got the Caribbean governments because he can give them good trade goods. So these are Taft's tools that he was able to use to be able to get into things. It's just quick: protectorate relationship, Platt Amendment and Panama Canal, custom receivership should be right here, and then the Payne-Aldrich tariff. So in each of these cases, all three of these things help create a stable place, or at least a good conditions for this type of policy. So now we have Nicaragua, and we have the leader of Nicaragua by the name of Jose Santos Zelaya. He was the longtime dictator, and he was not a nice guy. He wanted to dominate all of Central America, and so he started basically having his army invade Honduras, invade Costa Rica, with the idea that he would take them over. He also began to kind of talk about some things that would make the United States really nervous. Knox and Taft both viewed him as the causes of much of the upheaval in the region. Given that the Panama Canal is right here and he is right here, that causes some problems. And that also the fact that he was in talks and was bragging about the fact that he would sell Nicaraguan canal rights to a European country, which would then give a competition to the Panama Canal, which was not something the U.S. wanted to even entertain. Because if you look at it right here, you have Lake Nicaragua, and this is why Nicaragua was such a good place, because you dig here and you dig here, and now you've got a canal that is longer, would take longer in a sense to traverse, but you wouldn't have to do the locks. And so this becomes much more complicated, whereas this would have been much smoother. And so the canal rights for Nicaragua was something that was attractive to some European countries with the idea of competing with the United States. Specifically, Germany was one that was really interested. And so Knox decided, as soon as they became president, that this was somebody that they needed to go after. This was somebody they needed to remove. So in 1909, the Conservative Party, basically the people in Nicaragua who own land, the people who had are benefiting from U.S. investment, benefiting from a stronger economy, wanted to get rid of this guy right here with the sweet mustache. And so the foreign money, so the revolution was successful in 1910. And what they did was they sent 2,700 Marines into this area of the blue fields right here. Okay? And in that area was U.S. investment. Well, that allowed the guy who wanted to revolt, Estrada, This gave Juan Estrada an opportunity to organize his forces and get ready to strike at Zayaya, because Zayaya was much stronger than he was right away. And so by creating a situation where the United States would then kind of allow the insurgents to strike, go back, and then Zayaya had nothing he could do because he had to go through 2,700 U.S. Marines and didn't want to do that. And so the United States expected fiscal reform in Nicaragua and refused to recognize any new government that didn't have this. So basically, when Zayaya resigned, the U.S.-backed rebels in Nicaragua, and much of their funds and people had been coming from U.S. mining interests and others that saw Zayaya as a destabilizing force that would not help them. So Juan Estrada basically comes on board. And so the United States told him, we're not going to recognize your government unless you agree to American control of the custom houses and to refund the debt owed to British bankers by means of a loan from U.S. financiers. After the U.S. pacified the country, Knox encouraged U.S. bankers to invest in Nicaragua and offered substantial loans to the new regime. This gave the U.S. increased financial leverage over the country, and 2 years later, the new pro-U.S. government, now supported by the U.S. with a large loan by the U.S., falters and basically faced a revolt themselves. Taft, in order to not lose that loan, in order to make sure that they were guaranteed, had to send U.S. troops back into Nicaragua, and then they had to sit there. And they remained for over a decade. So this whole idea of replacing dollars with bullets was not very successful, as they had to, after destabilizing Zayaya, they then had to have basically the Marines stay there. And so this leads to the fact that basically U.S. mining companies wanted Zayaya out. Knox and Taft wanted Zayaya out. Estrada revolted. And basically he wins. And this leads to the resignation. But 2 years later, the pro-U.S. government faced a revolt. Taft sent U.S. troops to protect the U.S.-imposed leaders, and the U.S. troops remained there for over a decade. So when we look at the dollar diplomacy, we look at how effective it was, and in the main place was this idea of Nicaragua in this case study here. And we can see that if you have to send in U.S. troops and they have to remain there for a decade, that the policy itself was not successful. They didn't wind up making, the U.S. did not make Nicaragua a protectorate until 1916, and that was under Wilson. So we will talk about that with Woodrow. This was something Taft wanted, but Congress denied him. And so Taft tried to use dollar diplomacy in China. He tried to use it in the Dominican Republic. And every place he tried to use it with this idea of giving money out was unsuccessful. And because of who he was giving the money to. If you give the money to the government, but you're not willing to help them make any significant changes to their economy, then the majority of the country is still not benefiting. So you can pump a lot of money in, but if it goes to the same people that already had the money and doesn't go to all the other people in the country, then you have a situation where there's going to be constant revolt and instability. So the idea of pumping money and making an economy stronger is good and sound. The idea of doing it through government loans and reorganizing them in a sense that leaves them in that situation is poor thinking and a poor idea. You have to make sure that it gets to the rank and file, the populace, and that they can benefit from the growth in the economy. And then you will get them on board, and then you will have stability.